Patience, the ability to wait or to continue doing something despite difficulties or to suffer without complaining or becoming annoyed. Patience, a virtue that not many possess, but those who do are often thought of as the most remarkable people in society. But what happens when that patience is taken advantage of and even costs you your life? Hi, I'm Dev,
And I'm Cam.
and you're listening to Criminalish, a true crime podcast where two best friends trade stories ranging from the wild and wacky to the downright messed up. So today I will be telling Cam about the murder of Shirley May Merritt, which took place in Stone Mountain, Georgia in 2019. Have you heard about this case before, Cam?
I have not, but very familiar with Stone Mountain.
Absolutely. We've spent many an hour on Stone Mountain.
Yeah, and if you live in or around Atlanta, you know that is like one of the only places to hike in the nearby area.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But before we get into today's case formally, what are you drinking, friend?
So today I am drinking this butterfly pea and lavender lemonade that I got from this fresh market that is downstairs in my food hall. What you drinking, friend?
I am a lying liar who lies, and I am back drinking another brown sugar boba milk tea after last week when I said I was going to do a new drink. So I apologize deeply. I don't know who I've hurt with this, but I apologize deeply. I promise I will do better next episode. I promise I will. Cam is shaking her head at me for those of you who are listening to audio only. She too is disappointed.
How dare you? Don't let us down again.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And finally, before we get into today's case, I do want to extend trigger warnings for domestic violence, elder abuse, and alcoholism. So, to get into today's case, Shirley May Merritt was born Shirley May Benson on September 27th, 1941, to her parents Edgar and Hazel Benson. She had two sisters, Donna and Gail, and by all accounts, she had a very good childhood and a very good relationship with her family. While I don't know much about Shirley's early life, I do know that she has been described as a very loving and happy woman who made everyone around her feel loved and cared for. And this loving personality would lead her to marry a U.S. airman named Robert Kenneth Merritt on October 31st, 1959. Robert Kenneth Merritt was born on December 26, 1937, to his parents, Shadrach and Velma Merritt, and he was an only child. And while I also know very little about his early life, I do know that he joined the U.S. Air Force before marrying Shirley May on October 31st, 1959. As a result of Robert's career, the couple moved around quite a bit, living in many places, including Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Missouri, Virginia, and even Saudi Arabia. But all these moves did not stop the growth of the Merritt family. Robert and Shirley would have a little boy who they named Robert Jr. in 1965, and 9 years later, they would have another son they named Richard Merritt in 1974. And just so you guys know, for clarification of the Roberts, I will be referring to them from this point forward as Robert Sr. and Robert Jr. And by all accounts, the Merritt family is extremely happy. They were very well liked, and the household seemed to be held together and really supportive of one another. And sometime in the early 90s, Robert Sr. would retire as a full colonel from the U.S. Air Force, and the family would settle down in Georgia. And it is here that Shirley would actually enter a new career as Robert Sr. left his. By this point, Robert Jr. had already left the family home, and their other son, Richard, was about to exit high school and go to college. It is my belief that this transitional period was happening, so Shirley decided to go out and get a new career for herself as things around her were changing. And Shirley would begin working at the Patient and Family Services at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. And this really seemed to be the place where Shirley just found her passion to love on parents and children who were fighting illnesses. And she was completely dedicated to her career. In her obituary, a coworker of hers wrote, quote, "I will always remember Shirley and her dedication to her job at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. She always had a wonderful smile, as well as taking such great care of all the families she came in contact with. Her kindness and generosity towards myself and my friends were deeply appreciated. She holds a place in my heart, and I will miss her." End quote.
From a timeline perspective, I feel like it makes sense that this is the time that Shirley decided to, put herself out there and start a new career, because her one son had already left and another son was getting ready to leave the house. So that's a big change for any parent. For the last 18 years, they've been used to having this constant presence around them. And now that is suddenly going to go away. So I know a lot of people who are going through that type of transition will often do things like pick up a new hobby or get a new job.
Absolutely. And I definitely think it's important that as your nest becomes empty, you find other ways to fill it, preferably with things that you love and for yourself and for your development. And there are countless stories on Shirley's obituary highlighting just how wonderful she was at work. And one of the stories that I actually found that I thought was really, really sweet is that Shirley loved to bake, and she would bake cakes at home and then bring them into work and give out slices to her coworkers and to the families and patients that she was seeing. And everyone just adored her for that, because she really radiated a lot of positivity in a place that can be very depressing and suffocating. And Shirley would go on to have a very long career in patient and family services at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. And while her professional life was going very well and thriving, there were some hiccups in her personal life. Robert Jr. would leave the family home for reasons that I do not know, and they didn't really seem to stay in close contact with one another after he left the house, but eventually they do seem to end up on better terms. I will say I didn't do any deep research into the initial cause of this estrangement, as I didn't feel like it was appropriate to look into family dynamics that were not directly related to this case. That's just a boundary that I like to set on this podcast, because I did get some questions about that on the previous episode of why I didn't go more in depth on somebody's estrangement from their family. If it's not directly related to the case, I don't find it appropriate to disclose that. So while Robert Jr.'s phase of life is a little more unknown at that time, we do have a really good understanding of what Richard Merritt was doing. Richard, on the other hand, would go on to graduate high school in 1992 before attending the University of Georgia and graduating in 1996. Go Dogs.
I knew it was coming.
You had to.
Mm-hmm.
And upon graduating from the University of Georgia, he received a bachelor's degree in English and political science. He would go on to earn his law degree at Mississippi College's School of Law in 1999. And in that same year, he would go on to marry his college sweetheart, a woman named Janine. The following year, in 2000, he would pass the bar exam and be admitted to the Georgia bar. And Shirley and Robert Sr. were so proud of their son, as he was now a lawyer and a prosecutor, no less. However, sadly, on November 27th, 2000, Robert Kenneth Merritt Sr. would actually pass away at the age of just 62 years old. And it has been said that Robert Sr.'s death really took a toll on Shirley, and I think that's completely understandable, because at the time of his death, they had been married almost 41 years, and she was devastated. So she really leaned on her children for support and spent most of her time providing for her children and inevitably her grandchildren. And this moment seems to be the catalyst for when she truly completely threw herself into work at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. But over the years, things would get better. Shirley learns to cope with the passing of her husband, and everything seems to be going very well for the Merritt family outside of Robert Sr.'s passing. But all of that would very quickly and abruptly change when Richard, seemingly out of nowhere, is arrested and charged with 34 felony counts of fraud.
This is the one who's the prosecutor, right?
Yes.
Okay, I am listening.
So, if you're as perplexed as Cam is right now, in order to fully explain everything that takes place, we're going to need to go back and do a little bit more of a deep dive into Richard Merritt. So remember, by all accounts, the Merritt children had a very happy upbringing and early life, and many who knew Richard as a child would describe him as the nicest guy you've ever met, extremely smart, and more than anything, charming. You know, smooth talker, charming. But while some people described Richard as charming and warm, most people thought of him as extremely arrogant and insecure. He always found a way to make the conversation about himself, and he always found a way to put down somebody to make himself feel bigger, especially as he would describe himself as an extremely smart and successful lawyer who is leaps and bounds beyond his peers. Sources have even reported that if somebody else was talking about a promotion they got or an opportunity they got, Richard would become visibly upset and even hostile if he perceived their accomplishment as bigger than his own. And not only would he be offended, he would then go on to belittle said accomplishment and act like it wasn't a big deal, which is very much the epitome of, the friend that's never happy for you, which, hate to break it to you, that person is not your friend. But that's exactly who Richard was. And not only would he make you feel bad for your accomplishments, he would also lie and make up accomplishments that were slightly better than yours just so that he could make sure that you were underneath him. And it wasn't just reserved for his peers. He also did this to his wife. Janine has reported that Richard was verbally abusive and would fly off the handle at the drop of a dime, especially if he was drinking. But she's also reported that he always made sure to take the family on lavish vacations if he had ever flown off the handle. Which is what, Cam?
A cycle of abuse. Very common cycle of abuse.
Ding, 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 ding.
For both the children and Janine.
Absolutely. And when it does come to his career, he served 3.5 years as the prosecutor for the Fulton County Solicitor's Office before transitioning to the Georgia Attorney General's Office to represent the state of Georgia in any civil lawsuits. And he would work in this division for a short period of time. I'm actually unsure of how long he was actually at the Attorney General's office, but he would leave this office to start his own law firm. And his law firm focused primarily on elder abuse and medical malpractice. And in a lot of ways, this practice did make Richard very successful. He was able to make a lot of money as he was a private attorney who was settling cases for millions of dollars. That is, if you ask Richard. In reality, Richard may have seemed successful and wealthy, but he attained every single cent of it illegally. Richard was found to be stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from his clients. He would accept a case, and then he would settle that client's case and wouldn't tell them.
Wow. You might get into this more, but how long was this going on?
We're going to get into it, friend. I don't have an exact date and timeline for you, but we can do a rough estimate based on some information that we're going to find out later.
That is such a terrible thing to do to somebody. They even trusted you. They trust you as the expert to help them out with this thing that only you can do, because only people who have this certification that you have can do this thing. So they've entrusted you, and you take their trust and you take their money and you just leave them hanging. That is wild.
Cam, I don't know if you realize just how much you hit the nail on the head, because Richard would do exactly that. He would get on people's cases and he would settle those cases, but he just made sure that he never told the client he settled those cases. And he would make up some excuse about how the legal system is a long process and the caseload is all backed up, whatever. Meanwhile, he had already settled their case and pocketed that individual's money. And reportedly, he would continue belaboring these cases with the hopes that his clients would just die before he would get caught. And remember, Richard's firm focuses on personal injury, elder abuse, and medical malpractice. So he is stealing the money from extremely vulnerable people who are desperate and they need it. And if it wasn't bad enough that he was stealing money from all these vulnerable people, he was also still charging them his hourly rate. So his clients would continue to pay him for cases that he had already settled and stolen the money from.
Oh my gosh, what is wrong with this person? I totally forgot that you said that his firm was focused on personal injury, specifically elder abuse and medical malpractice. And then you're still charging them? Telling them that, oh, it's just the legal system that's getting bogged down? Oh my gosh.
It adds an extra layer of sleaziness, doesn't it?
Yeah, and we haven't even gotten to the main crime, and I'm already blown.
I was too, friend. So Richard was able to hide this lie from everyone. He would tell people that he was just an amazing lawyer, and he kept having clients come back over and over again, which is how he was able to collect his wealth. He would even tell people that he would settle cases for millions and millions of dollars, which is how he got a significant portion of the winnings, because that was the amount that he was due to be paid out by his clients. But like all criminals who do extremely unethical and illegal things, Richard would be caught when two of his clients realized what he was doing and called the police. And not only did they have a suspicion, they had hard evidence that Richard had stolen their money. And they turned this over to the police, and a warrant was issued for Richard's arrest. Richard would actually turn himself in to the local police department, but he was immediately bailed out by his wife. And I'm sure you're wondering, Dev, why the hell did she bail him out? Well, that's because, one, she's in an abusive relationship, and two, he reportedly told his wife that these two clients were simply unsatisfied with his work after losing a case and had made it their mission to destroy his life and his family. And he assured her that they had no actual proof of his wrongdoing. And she believed him because she knew that he was in a business with a lot of money, and a lot of unhappy clients can sometimes do crazy things. So she completely believed him, hoping that this whole incident would be quickly laid to rest. However, as news of Richard's arrest started to spread in the community, his other clients began wondering if they too had been scammed by Richard. And as his other clients reviewed their records, they quickly realized that Richard had been stealing money from them as well. And it would come out that Richard had stolen from over 17 different people, and this would lead to Richard being arrested once again. And just so y'all know, Once Janine realized that Richard was lying to her and that he actually had stolen money from multiple clients, she immediately filed for divorce and took full custody of their two children, which I am so proud of her for because, again, she's very much in an abusive relationship and it's very hard to leave. And I'm very, very proud of her for that.
Yeah, I think this probably showed her how much of a liar he was, because with the, flying off the handle and then doing the trips, I'm sure it was in her head like, oh, like, yes, he sometimes gets mad, especially when he drinks, but like he can be a nice person. But I think when she found this out, she realized who he was at his core, because no one who is at their core a nice and caring person would do that.
Absolutely. And then Richard continued to show why he's not a good person because, in a lot of ways, it seemed like the divorce angered him more than the arrest. And Janine and her two children would actually move out of the family home to avoid any connection to Richard so that he couldn't have anything to hold over Janine's head. She would also call each and every victim personally and apologize to them. And she told them that she was unaware of where the money was coming from and she had no idea that Richard was stealing from his clients. Which I personally do believe her when she says that she didn't know, because by all accounts, she didn't have access to their finances. Again, Richard is lying to her about how much money is coming into the firm and what his cut of the settlements are. I'm sure to her, the math was mathing.
Yeah, I mean, he's a private attorney, and there are private attorneys who do make that kind of money and who can afford to buy the things that he was buying, especially the vacations and trips. So I don't really fault her. And I definitely understand the guilt that she felt knowing that she was spending other people's money.
So upon Janine and her two children leaving the family home and his subsequent arrest, Richard was incapable of making payments on the family home, and he would actually lose his house and be forced to move back into his childhood home with his mother, Shirley. Now, again, Shirley was extremely kind and supportive of Richard. She was giving him all the motherly love that he needed in this hard time that he had created for himself. And it would not surprise me if he was lying to her too and making it seem like everybody was out to get him and nothing was his fault. And Shirley would even go to some of Richard's court dates and she would sit in the trial on his side, supporting him, despite everything she heard. But in February of 2007, Richard would admit to knowingly stealing $75,000 from his clients. And he would voluntarily surrender his law license after he was swiftly disbarred. He was not held in jail prior to his trial, but he was forced to wear an ankle monitor 100% of the time. And for some reason that I'm not quite sure of, Richard thought that if he was compliant with the ankle monitor and admitted to some faults, that the prosecution would make him a deal and he wouldn't have any long-term issues related to this case.
So clearly he was not a good lawyer.
Girl, we're going to get into him not being a good lawyer because there's more tea there too.
Sir, this is supposed to be your specialty.
Hello. But I guess Richard just expected the prosecutors to not do their job like he never did his job, and expected the prosecutors not to find out that Richard had actually stolen over $500,000 from his clients, as well as forged their signatures so that he could cash in their checks for himself.
I was about to say, because 75,000 did sound a little light, just in terms of knowing that he had stolen from at least 17 clients.
Yep. And it also feels really light when you think about the fact that he has 34 felony counts. And you're telling me they only add up to $75,000? Try again, sir. But, of course, the prosecution did find out this information, and Richard would not be offered any deal. But he would still plead guilty in January of 2019 to all 34 counts, including theft, forgery, exploitation of an elderly person, and bank account fraud targeting. And he would be sentenced to 15 years in prison, followed by 15 years of probation. However, before he was scheduled to report to prison, the judge overseeing the case allowed him 2 weeks to get his affairs in order before he needed to surrender to the local prison. And I do want to say that at his sentencing, a lot of his victims came forward and spoke against his release.
He just seemed like a flight risk.
Absolutely. And one of his victims even said, if you allow him to leave, he will never come back. And he's just going to go out and scam more people right before he has to go to prison. However, despite this, the judge would still give Richard 2 weeks to handle any affairs before reporting to prison. And at his sentencing, Richard actually made a statement that he accepts responsibility and accepts the judge's sentence, as he had made a grave error, that he was going to be better in the future, starting by being a model prisoner. Which this statement for me just goes back into his arrogance and him thinking too highly of himself. Because again, it's always about, oh, I'm going to be the best. I'm going to be a model prisoner. Sir, you frauded the elderly. What are you talking about?
Right. He's like, you know what? Anything I do, I'm going to be the best. Even if I'm a prisoner, I'm going to be the best prisoner. And the gag is, you had the chance to be the best lawyer and you failed miserably.
Hello. So Richard was scheduled to show up for his prison sentence on February 1st of 2019. So the days leading up to Richard turning himself in, reportedly, he was ready to turn himself in. He was ready to take the next steps in his life and hopefully put the past fraud behind him. His lawyer even stated, quote, days before he was to turn himself in and begin serving his sentence, Mr. Merritt sounded upbeat and optimistic about his chances of parole after serving just 5 years, end quote. And I just want y'all to know that I only put this in here because we have to take a moment and talk about the white man audacity of it all. Because, sir, you got sentenced to 15 years in prison and you think that you won't even serve a third of your sentence? Most people start talking about parole at 50%. And depending on what state you're in and like the seriousness of the crime, it's mandatory 75%. But you talking about this at a third? 33.33%? I'm confused.
The audacity.
I done told you multiple times I got to get some more of it because that white man audacity is different. However, despite this alleged optimism, Richard would never report to prison. The next series of events is what happened based on the evidence found and presented at trial. And that's because on January 31st, 2019, Richard and Shirley were going to sit down for a meal together. Shirley had even made Richard's favorite food, spaghetti and dinner rolls. She set up 2 place settings and made 2 plates, one for each of them. While it is not known what prompted the next series of events, investigators believe that it is at this moment that Richard got into some kind of argument with his mother. And as a result of that argument, Richard would violently attack his mother in the kitchen where she had just made him a meal. It is believed that Richard grabbed a kitchen knife from the home and began stabbing Shirley repeatedly in her neck and face. And this attack was so violent that Richard actually breaks the knife during the attack, and the blade would be left lodged in Shirley's head. It is then believed that Richard would throw the broken handle on the kitchen floor and go to his bedroom where he retrieved a 35-pound dumbbell and began beating his mother's body with this dumbbell. And it is at this moment that Richard then decides to open the basement door that is just outside the kitchen and throw his mother's body down the stairs.
What? What in the world? I can't even imagine someone doing this to a stranger, let alone the person who birthed and raised you and who is stuck beside you.
That's the part that hurt me the most, friend. She was there for you. She supported you. She loved you. She moved you back into the family home. She showed so much patience with you. And this is what you do in return.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, let's get into what happened next, because I got to figure out what happened to this man.
You're going to be a mix of confused and pissed off. I'm going to tell you that right now, off rip.
Great.
Because at this moment, Richard's panic finally starts to set in. And he realizes what he has done the day before he is supposed to go report to the prison. And in response to this panic, he cuts off his ankle monitor, grabs a small bag and puts a few clothes in it, shaves off his beard, and steals his mother's car before fleeing the scene. He gets in his mother's car and starts driving north towards Tennessee. And in a crazy twist of irony, he would actually drive right past the prison he was supposed to report to as he began going on the run. So, as you can imagine, on February 1st, when Richard is scheduled to report to prison, he doesn't show up. And authorities are not immediately concerned about this, so they simply issue a warrant for his arrest and inform his attorney that Richard needs to show up to prison or it's going to cause a lot more issues for him. Now, you and I know that he's already left, but the authorities didn't know this just yet. That is until 2 days later, on February 2nd, 2019. Richard's older brother, Robert Jr., makes a stop at the family home. And I'm unsure if Robert was just checking in to see his mother or if Robert was there in relation to try to get Richard to go turn himself into the prison. But I do know that he goes into the house and he notices the place settings at the dining room table. And he's like, wow, that's odd. It's not like Mom to leave place settings at the dinner table. And then he continues to walk deeper into the home. And this is where he finds the scene of his mother's murder in the kitchen. And upon seeing this scene, Robert runs out of the house and immediately calls the police because he's not sure what happened in the house, but something bad has definitely happened. And once police and paramedics arrive, they would be the ones to discover the body of 77-year-old Shirley Merritt, who lay dead at the bottom of the basement stairs in her own home.
I'm glad that Robert wasn't the one to find her body, because to see her discarded like that in her own home, it's already hard enough having to deal with something like that, especially if they had a complicated relationship. I couldn't imagine adding on to that, being the one to find her and see her like that.
Absolutely. I was too super happy that he wasn't the one to find her, even if he found the scene. Because nobody needs to see their mother like that. Nobody needs to see anybody like that. But especially your mom, like you said, if they did have a complicated relationship, the crazy amount of emotions that you would feel in that moment, while I'm sure he still has a lot to work through and figure out, I am just glad that that's not one of them. Finding her body is not one of them. And not only was Robert devastated, but the community was utterly devastated by Shirley's passing. Again, she was described as such a loving and caring woman, and here she was brutally murdered in her own home and discarded. And she would later be laid to rest on Tuesday, February 12th, 2019, at H.M. Patterson and Sons, Arlington Chapel. So, police begin their investigation, and pretty much immediately, everybody pointed the finger at Richard. And police were very quickly able to figure out that Richard's DNA and fingerprints were all over the crime scene. And they were also able to quickly figure out that he had stolen Shirley's car and was on the run. Police not only received multiple sightings of the vehicle after they released this information to the public, but they were also able to get surveillance video from the gas station that captured Richard getting gas in his mother's car. And while this seems like the perfect lead and that police are quickly going to go and apprehend Richard, they did not find him immediately. And for the next 8 months, Richard would remain on the run. So, in Atlanta, news stories are running almost daily about a man wanted for the murder of his mother, as well as the prison sentence he's supposed to be serving for his fraud cases that he had already pled guilty to. And news outlets would label Richard as somebody who was presumed armed and dangerous. And news outlets would actually conduct an interview with Richard's older brother, Robert. And Robert would give an exclusive interview in the family home where Shirley was murdered. Not only about his life and his connection to Richard, but just how sweet his mother was and his reaction to coming home and seeing the scene that he saw. And I will leave a link below for you to go and check out this interview. It's quite short. It's not like a full 45-minute interview or anything like that. But the most striking part of the interview for me was when the interviewer asked him if he would be able to forgive Richard. To which Robert responds, quote, "The jury's still out on that one," end quote. And I think this is very telling of a man who is quite hurt by what his brother has done, yet is still allowing him the space to forgive him if his brother would just end the manhunt and take responsibility for his actions. Because in that same interview, Robert directly tells Richard that this has to end and that he has to turn himself in.
Yeah, because how can I forgive you? You haven't even taken accountability.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, this interview does not appeal to Richard's sympathies, and he remains on the run. So, for the next 8 months, Richard is living the good life up in Nashville, Tennessee, thinking that he is going to avoid jail time altogether.
Wait.
And yes, you heard me correctly. He ran away to Nashville, Tennessee, exactly 1 state away and less than 4 hours away from downtown Atlanta.
I'm not rooting for him at all, but try a little harder. Like, I don't know.
Absolutely try a little harder. But also, Atlanta police, how did y'all not find this man? He was 4 hours up the street.
Yeah.
Come on now.
God forbid he would have went to the other coast. They'd still be looking for him today.
Hold up now. If he had gotten out of the country, we'd be talking about him the same way we were talking about
Sharon Kinney.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It's been 54 years and we've never seen that man again. So, in Nashville, Tennessee, Richard is attempting to move on with his life and is living under the name Mick Malvo.
Just a side note, for anyone who is a fan of the Fargo show, it's just really funny because one of the characters in the first season has the last name Malvo. Well, we actually don't know if that's his real name, but that's the name he uses the most. He has the last name Malvo, and he is a terrible person. Just cold-blooded killer. So it's just very interesting that he chose that name. The season would have been out by the time this was happening.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's definitely hilarious. Almost as hilarious as the fact that Richard had started to move on with his life. He had gotten himself a small apartment, and he had even started signing up for multiple dating apps. And on these dating app profiles, he would make up like different stories for himself to make himself really important. And on his profile, it also said that his mother had recently passed away from leukemia. And that had put everything in perspective for him. And he knew it was time for him to settle down.
So many things are going through my head right now. One, was he using his pictures, his real pictures on these apps?
Yes, ma'am.
Wow. Bold. Two, he even points out that his mother had passed from leukemia. Also, I feel like that's just doubly messed up because she worked at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, where I'm sure she dealt with a lot of leukemia cases.
That part, that pissed me off so bad because I had that exact same thought. How dare you?
Yeah.
How dare you?
Wow, this man is getting my blood boiling. Wow. And also, how did they not find him?
Okay.
Police can't do anything.
Okay now. And not only was he on dating apps, he was successful. He was dating a woman semi seriously in Nashville. But on the bright side, it would actually be these dating apps that would allow the police to figure out where he was before they finally arrested him in October of 2019. Now, unfortunately, I do not know the circumstances of Richard's arrest. But in my heart of hearts, I just like to believe that the police catfished him and got him to go on a date with them so that they could arrest him. And again, I'm not saying that's what happened, but I just like to believe that's what happened because it would make me happier.
And to add on to this hypothetical, I also want to believe that they didn't just do it as soon as he showed up. They let him go through the date, talk about himself, big up himself. They probably had the person ask him some questions that were supposed to throw him off some. And then right as they were walking outside, he was, thinking he might get lucky. That's when they pulled up and were like, yep, you're under arrest.
See, that's the version of events that I dream about. And I'm going to allow myself to think that's what happened because it's way more interesting.
Same.
So now that Richard has been caught and it's finally time for him to go back to Atlanta and face the music, Richard was charged with malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. And as you can imagine, Richard is screaming his innocence during his arrest, and he would formally plead not guilty to all charges.
Did he get charged for not showing up to prison?
Yes, he did, but those punishments are going to be in relation to the fraud case, not in relation to the murder case because they are separated.
Got you.
So now it's time to get into the second trial of Richard Merritt. So you might be thinking, this is a pretty open and shut case, right? The prosecution showed their timeline of events, showed evidence of Richard's DNA and fingerprints at the crime scene. Though the police were unable to get fingerprints from the handle of the knife, but they were able to not only get his fingerprints, but also his DNA from the dumbbell. They presented the fact that Shirley was killed by a kitchen knife from her own home. And there's no evidence of forced entry or other individuals at the scene. And we also have evidence of Richard's hair from his beard in the sink upstairs next to a razor blade, as well as his mother's car stolen on multiple traffic cameras, leaving the state of Georgia. As well as Richard himself in the gas station heading towards Tennessee. So the prosecution lays out their entire case. A case that essentially came down to Richard was too cowardly to take responsibility for his actions and instead chose to murder the one person that was always on his side. And then he ran and hid from police. But I'm sure you can guess that the defense has the perfect answer for all of this.
Are they going to say that someone else did it and he just ran away because he was scared and they threatened that if he told, they would do something to him too?
Wow, Cam, you know that best friend telepathy is going crazy this week.
I was like, what is the most audacious thing this man could say?
Oh, girl, we about to get into audacious because the defense argument is that, yes, Richard's DNA is in the house, but he was living there. And yes, Richard's DNA and fingerprints are on the dumbbells because he owned those dumbbells. But it was not Richard who killed his mother. Yet he was a witness to his mother's murder. And who better to tell the story of what they saw than Richard Merritt himself, as Richard chooses to take the stand in his own defense. And I found this particularly stupid as you are a former prosecutor. You should be aware of the fact that almost never does getting on the stand actually help you. Almost never. But he decides to do it anyway.
I am actually not surprised because he's convinced himself he can do everything better than anyone else. So even if he knew, those people might have took the stand, didn't go well for them, they're not me. He was thinking, you know what? All I got to do is go up on the stand, talk to the people nice, show them that charm, and I'm good.
That part. And I will say, that was actually something that really surprised me. I just knew this man was going to go and defend himself. But he did get counsel. But I was 100% convinced this man was going to try to defend himself.
That wouldn't have surprised me either.
Right. So I was actually surprised he was smart enough to get counsel, but stupid enough to take the stand. Guess you got to have a balance of everything in life.
Right.
So Richard takes the stand, and he spends probably the first 30 minutes of his testimony talking about his life, his family, and how great his life was, how smart he was, all the accolades and accomplishments he had ever done in his entire life. And I feel like this portion of his testimony really goes to what people were saying about his ego and that he thinks very, very highly of himself, because this man does indeed think that he's the best thing since sliced bread. But after gloating about all of his accomplishments, of course, leaving out the part where he was disbarred for frauding the elderly, of course, we're going to leave that part out, even though we are 100% allowed to talk about it in the trial because you pled guilty, aka you did it. So, whatever.
So I know that there are specific parameters that need to be met when it comes to bringing up past convictions. So can you explain why the prosecution was able to bring up his previous fraud conviction in this trial?
Yes. So you're absolutely correct in that it is case by case, but generally prosecutions are allowed to bring up previous convictions. And only convictions. It can't be indictments or anything like that. Only convictions if it is directly related to the case, or it goes to show your character or a pattern of behavior. They are allowed to bring those things up. Especially in Richard's case, when he decided to take the stand, the prosecution's absolutely allowed to go after his character, because one of the things the jury is allowed to consider when you take the stand is your character and who you are. So on top of the character evidence of it all, in this case, the prosecution believed that the entire murder was predicated on him going to prison for those previous crimes. So that's why they were allowed to bring it up, because they were directly related to one another based on the prosecution's outline of the case. So after gloating about all of his accomplishments for 30 minutes, he gets to the day of the murder. And according to Richard, he and his mother sat down at the dining room table, ready to eat his favorite meal that she had prepared for him, when two armed men broke into the home and held Richard and his mother up at gunpoint. And Richard stated that these two men were after Richard because they knew somebody that he had stolen money from, and they had come to get revenge on Richard and his family. And these two men held Richard at gunpoint and forced him to watch as one of them stabbed his mother to death and subsequently beat her with the dumbbell before throwing her down the basement stairs. And Richard stated that he was told by these gunmen that if he uttered a single word about what happened, they would murder his ex-wife and his two children. And they told him to leave the state of Georgia. So, because of this, Richard stated that he knew that if he stayed in the house, he would be blamed for the murder. And if he called the police, he would be putting his ex-wife and his two children in grave danger. And thus, he decided it was better for him to flee to Nashville and start a new life.
But him telling the story now is okay.
Oh, of course, of course. He just needed to make sure everybody knew what really happened.
Now his ex-wife and two children aren't in danger. Got you. Okay. Yeah.
Of course. Everything's going to be fine. So after Richard spins this entire story on the stand, it is then the prosecution's turn to cross-examine Richard. And again, similarly to how Nancy acted on the stand, where you could just tell that she hated the prosecutor, in my opinion, intentionally, I'm not mad about it though, intentionally got under Richard's skin. And they systematically broke down everything he said, starting with the prosecution quickly being able to dispel on the stand this entire notion that somebody else was in the house because no one else's DNA was in the house. And this stabbing incident was frenzied and violent, and she was stabbed multiple times, so much so that the knife was broken in her body. And with this kind of attack, you would expect the assailant to cut themselves and leave some of their DNA at the scene. But yet, no other DNA besides Shirley and Richard's DNA was found. The prosecution also brought up the fact that if you had seen this horrific murder, you made no effort to call any help for your mother. What if she was alive? What if she was breathing? And you made no effort to call for her. And this was a personal favorite of mine, but the prosecution is basically like, so you were held at gunpoint and they chose to kill your mother with items from within your home. Correct.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah. They held you at gunpoint, but there's no evidence of a gun being used.
Of course. Why would they do that?
Clearly to make his story seem not true. They were thinking way ahead.
Exactly. They knew they were going to frame him for the murder of his mother, so they needed to plan accordingly.
Yeah, they didn't shed any DNA. Mm-hmm. They fixed the broken door, too, so it didn't seem like anyone broke in.
Of course. And while Cam and I are making a little bit of jest about this whole thing, I do want to stress to you how much of an arrogant jerk Richard comes off as when he's on the stand. He wants you to believe that he was terrified and panicked about what happened to his mother, that he was on the verge of a mental breakdown when he ran from the family home. But on the stand, he speaks about her so coldly. There's no love, there's no affection, despite the fact that she was probably the only person in his corner that was supporting him. Especially after she stuck by his side when his wife rightfully filed divorce through his trial and allowed you to live in her house. And it seemed like she truly believed in her son and she wanted to believe in him. And in return, he mercilessly murders her and takes no accountability and lies on the witness stand, in my opinion. He lied on the witness stand so much that I was actually concerned about his lawyer's license, because part of the thing with being a defense attorney, you can't lie to the court. You have ethical obligations and things as well. But the lies were just so outrageous and just did not match any of the physical evidence so bad that I was like, hey, sir, are you worried about losing your license after this? Because this feels a little borderline of like what your ethical obligations are.
Yeah.
But after 2 weeks of trial, Richard was quickly found guilty on all counts, including malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault. And according to reports, the only time Richard showed any emotion during this trial was when the verdict was read out. Reportedly, quote, he dropped his head, took off his glasses, and began rubbing his eyes, end quote. And I personally love the distinction that, oh, no, he was not crying. There were no tears were seen. He was just rubbing his eyes, which to me says a lot because I actually do think there is sadness there. But that's sadness for himself. He feels sorry for himself. He feels sorry that he has to put up with this, that he has to deal with this. Not because he did anything. Not because he has made his family's life miserable. Not that he has murdered his mother and hurt so many people that she adored. Never that. He is sad for himself. For the predicament that he has put himself into. At sentencing, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yet, he maintains his innocence to this day. And I want to wrap up this episode with a final quote from Shirley's obituary, which is, quote, words really can't express how I feel right now. I worked with Miss Shirley in guest services at CHOA. And all I can do when I think of her is laugh and smile. She was a ray of sunshine and will be greatly missed. I am truly sorry for your loss, but I know she is in heaven, baking cakes and making others smile. In lieu of flowers, the family suggests tribute donations to the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta Foundation. End quote. And in honor of Shirley's memory and the foundation that she loved so much, we are also going to encourage our audience to make a donation to the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta Foundation in support of today's episode. And we will be leaving a link for you below, as well as in our running Excel spreadsheet of charities that we personally support. And that is the end of our story, friend.
I just cannot get over the depravity of this crime, of her death. And I can't imagine what she was thinking in her last moments, because I'm sure this was the last person that she would have expected this from. Even though he'd shown that he had a bad character, I know that Shirley didn't want to believe that this was something at his core, because she'd raised him. And she wanted to believe that she'd raised a good person, even if that good was buried beneath a whole bunch of layers. And I just can't imagine her final moments realizing how bad of a person he was.
Absolutely. The mix of fear, confusion, sadness is so devastating. And I think the worst part about this case for me is that we really don't know what happened. We have no idea why he flew off the handle and did what he did. And especially to somebody who everybody loved so much and was the epitome of a sweet old woman who would bake cakes and bring them to sick children. It's just devastating. And in Shirley's obituary, there was testimonial after testimonial about people who were so sad about her passing and how amazing of a person she was. And for her to leave this earth the way that she did, and for her son to still take no accountability, to show no sadness for what you have done to your own mother, is insanity to me. Especially a mother that was actually supportive of you, who actually loved you, who actually wanted to be by your side. Some people have terrible relationships with their parents. Some people have horrible parents. And here you go, from being the family golden child to the family disappointment, and she didn't care. She loved you. She supported you. And you gave her nothing to back the faith that she put into you. You instead did the exact opposite and proved everybody else right.
I'm glad that Janine and her children got away when they did, because who knows what would have happened if she hadn't left.
Absolutely. And that's always the scariest thing to think about, right? And I didn't talk about this during the episode, but Janine also did an interview that she was fearful for her and her children's safety when she heard that he was on the run.
Yeah, I could see that, because when some people go on the run, they want to take their children with them.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's like the levels of hurt that you put on this family and the greater community. Shirley was well liked. She was adored. And you took away a light, in my opinion, for nothing. For no reason.
Yeah, I just hope that Robert and Shirley's family and loved ones are getting through the best that they can, because they lost two people. I'm sure Robert and Richard might have had a complicated relationship too, but at the end of the day, that was his brother. And that's not really his brother anymore. That's not the person that he thought his brother was. So it's always hard when something like this happens and it's one family member causing the death of another, because it's hard to grieve. You're grieving multiple people, and it's such complicated emotions. So yeah, I just hope the best for them.
Absolutely. I wish the best for them as well.
As we wrap up today's discussion, we want to introduce a new segment called Today in Crime, where we'll describe a crime or crime-related event that took place on this day. On July 19th, 1879, Doc Holliday killed for the first time. For those who don't know, John Henry Holliday, better known as Doc Holliday, was a gambler, gunfighter, and dentist from the American Old West. He is best known for his role in something called the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. So if anybody is a fan of the Wild Wild West, I'm sure y'all are familiar with this man. So like I said, on this day, July 19th, 1879, Doc Holliday committed his first murder when he killed a man for shooting up his New Mexico saloon. So I am reading directly from history.com. So this is not my story. This is all coming from history.com. Despite his formidable reputation as a deadly gunslinger, Doc Holliday only engaged in 8 shootouts during his life, and it has been verified that he killed 2 men. Still, the smartly dressed ex-dentist had a remarkably fearless attitude toward death and danger, perhaps because he was slowly dying from tuberculosis. That's a crazy sentence. History.com.
That is wild. They got me because I was like, what are you?
Mm-hmm. In 1879, Holliday settled in Las Vegas, New Mexico, where he opened a saloon with a partner. Holliday spent his evenings gambling in the saloon, and he seemed determined to stress his health condition by heavy drinking. History.com is coming for him.
Right.
A notorious cad, Holiday also enjoyed the company of the dance hall girls that the partners hired to entertain the customers, which sometimes sparked trouble. On July 19th, 1879, a former Army scout named Mike Gordon tried to persuade one of Holiday's saloon girls to quit her job and run away with him. When she refused, Gordon became infuriated. He went out to the street and began to fire bullets randomly into the saloon. He didn't have a chance to do much damage because after the second shot, Holiday calmly stepped out of the saloon and dropped Gordon with a single bullet. Gordon died the next day. The following year, Holiday abandoned the saloon business and joined his old friend Wyatt Earp in Tombstone, Arizona. There, he would kill his second victim during the famous gunfight at the OK Corral in October 1881. During the subsequent 6 years, Holiday assisted at several other killings and wounded a number of men in gun battles. His hard drinking and tuberculosis eventually caught up with him, and he retired to a Colorado health resort where he died in 1887. Struck by the irony of such a peaceful end to a violent life, his last words reportedly were, quote, "This is funny," end quote.
That is the definition of men are so unserious. This man was so unserious.
I feel like especially back then.
Absolutely. The
life expectancy was like 28. So they were like, you know what? I'm here for a good time, not a long time.
Right. We gonna do it up. We gonna do it up big out here. That was very interesting, friend. Thank you so much for telling me that. Now I have some more knowledge for in case I ever do decide to go on Jeopardy.
If you also found this story interesting, leave a cowboy emoji in the comments.
So before we close out, any other thoughts, friend?
Nope, that's all I've got.
Thank you to our listeners for joining us on today's episode. I'd like to thank Dreading as well as Fox 5 Atlanta for providing most of the material for this episode. If you'd like to check out photos related to this case, please be sure to follow us at Criminalish Podcast on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube.
Listeners, if you like what you hear, be sure to tell a friend and leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening to the Criminalish Podcast. And if you are listening on YouTube, be sure to subscribe to our channel and feel free to leave any comments or questions. As always, stay nosy, my friends. Bye.
Bye.